In this video, I'm going to show you how you can keep a users table, which you've defined in Hasura, synchronized with a set of users in an Auth0 account. So more specifically, I'm going to show you how you can insert users into that table whenever a user signs up via Auth0, but also to use the data that's stored in your Hasura table to decide what claims appear in the token when the user logs in. Before we get into it, let me just quickly justify why I'm taking this approach. We essentially want to store some information about a user and then use that information to populate the claims in their token. So if you're familiar with Auth0, you might be thinking, well, why don't we just store that information in Auth0 in the first place? Auth0 has this metadata feature where you can store bits of information alongside each user record. So we could just keep all the information there and then we don't need to keep two different systems in sync. Well, that is certainly an approach you could take, but I think there's a few downsides. The first is that whenever we want to make updates to the information we hold about a user, we'd have to do it via the Auth0 API rather than directly in our database, although that one's not a particularly big deal. It would also make joins much more difficult. So if, for example, we wanted to get all the users in the system, and then we wanted to join it with some other table, like, for example, maybe we have some concept of organizations and users can belong to different organizations. We couldn't just do a regular table join. We'd have to be fetching things from the Auth0 API and then fetching things from our database and then manually joining them together. And on a related note, it might make it much harder to define our authorization rules using Hasura's permission system, because if some of the information we need is in Auth0 and some is in our database, then it might make it difficult or even impossible to express those rules. So it is one of those things that will be situation dependent. Maybe there are some projects where it would make total sense just to keep everything in Auth0. But I think for most products of a reasonable size, it'll very quickly get complicated if you try to keep information in Auth0. Instead, I want to keep as much information as I can in my own database so that I have full flexibility for making all the different joins that I want to make between the different bits of data that I hold. So let's get back into the implementation. If you haven't watched the previous videos in this series, we're implementing a blog with the backend implemented using Hasura. And so far we are able to log in using Auth0. But the thing is, we get some claims. We've set up Auth0 to return some claims that Hasura needs about what role the user has. But currently we use some bits of hard-coded logic in order to do this. What we would rather is that when the user logs in, this information about what role they have, for example, comes from a record in the database. And essentially that's the problem we're trying to solve in this video. Before we do anything else, we've got a bit of preliminary work to do because we need to actually create this user table. We don't have that yet. So before I do anything, I'm actually going to go and I'm going to delete all of my existing records in both my blog post activity and my blog posts. The reason is I'm about to start changing the schema a bit and add a foreign key relationship that they will currently violate. So we'll just start from a completely clean slate. Then we're going to go to our schema and we're going to create a new table. I'll just call it user. The user is going to have an ID, and I'm going to make this text because it's actually going to be the Auth0 ID that I'm going to use as the primary key for this column, and that's a string. I'm going to have the user name. So it's just one example of a bit of information you could store against the user, but you can imagine you could have all kinds of columns in here, like their first name and surname and their address and their phone number and anything else you wanted to store against them. And then finally, the role. So this is the Hasura role. So again, text. And ultimately, it's the value of this column that I want to appear in the claims when the user logs in. I want it to come from this place in the table. So let's set ID as the primary key, and we'll add that table. So we've got somewhere to store our users. Now, you might remember in previous videos in our blog post table, we already had a column called user ID, and we've been storing the Auth0 user ID in there when users create blog posts. So it makes sense that that now becomes a foreign key into the users table so that we can join those together nicely. So from user ID to the ID of the users table. Likewise, if we have this relationship between the blog post table and the users table, we also want to add a Hasura relationship, which is going to make it nice and easy to join records together when we're making queries through the GraphQL API. So I covered this more in the first video, the second video of the series, so refer back to that if you're not sure what I'm referring to. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a field called user, and that is going to contain all of the information about a user who created a blog post on the blog post record. Finally, we've created a new table, and that means by default all the permissions for the user table will be set to basically only admin can do anything on this table, and we don't want that. At the very least, I want my regular users to be able to select on this table because I want them to be able to get information about the users who created particular blog posts. Now, I think there might be a bit of a weakness in Hasura's permission system here. Perhaps there's something I'm missing, but the problem is I do want any user to be able to look up information about another user because, for example, when I'm viewing my blog posts on my front end, I want to be able to see the name of the user who created that blog post. So I need to be able to look up information about individual users. The only thing is the way the permission systems work, as far as I can see, is that I would therefore automatically give that user the ability to query all the users in the system if they wanted to via the GraphQL API. And I don't really want that because that could be quite dangerous. I could be leaking information. I'm not sure if there's an easy way around that, but what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to say without any custom checks, and then I'm just going to limit the number of rows to 1. So that prevents my users from being able to just enumerate all the other users in the system. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that they're allowed to get the name of any user given their user ID. And let's save that. I'd like to do a quick test now of all the relationships and everything that I just set up. So we're going to start inserting some blog posts and see how we can link information between the blog posts and the users table. The only thing is we don't have any users, and obviously it is the goal of our system for those users to get inserted automatically when we sign up. But it's not going to happen for the users that we've already created. So just for testing purposes for now, I'm going to insert a row into this table, and I'm going to use the ID of my existing user because this user is never going to get inserted automatically. It's already been created. Let's call myself test user. Test user, I do have a name, don't I? I think I'm user 2. Yeah, so I'm going to call myself test user 2 and give myself the user role, of course. Not that any of this stuff will affect the claims yet, but the ultimate goal is that it will. Let's save that. And now let's insert a blog post as that user. So I've got all my old ones still there. So let's just do a good old test post. And I'm going to go back to my API. And if I fetch all of the blog posts with a query that looks like this, blog post. So I can choose now. So I've got the content and the title. So let's just start with that. That's all fine. I can now choose to get information about the user, and that includes the user ID and their name and indeed their role, assuming I have permission to get those fields, which, because I'm currently an admin, I do. And so we can see that that relationship has worked. So we can get a blog post, and we can also drill down into the information about the user to see what their name is and so on. Also, just to make the front end a bit nicer, currently that's displaying the user ID, but I have implemented the functionality to display the user's name instead if it's present. We just need to add it into the query. So if you want to, go to the front end code. Specifically, you want to go to queries.js, and you'll see this query here. This is the GraphQL query that the front end code executes in order to fetch all the blog posts on that main screen. And all we need to do is we just need to add on user, curly brackets, and then name. And you'll find that that means that it then fetches the name, and I've already written the code to then display that name when it's present. So now we get a much nicer looking front end, and you can see how it's fetching this information from the user table. Anyway, we've now got our schema ready to go. So let's think about what we want to do next. We want it so that whenever a user signs up through Auth0, a record gets inserted into our database as well. And there's a relatively simple solution to that. We can just use Auth0's actions feature to hook into the post sign-up event, and then we can just call our GraphQL API in that event to insert the user. And that's what we're going to do. But there is one slight problem, which is that we're currently testing locally. If we had a deployed Hasura instance that was actually available on the public web, like we might do in production, then this wouldn't be a problem. But because we're currently testing locally, there's no way we can get Auth0 and its actions to make queries directly to our local Hasura instance running on our local machine. The solution I'm going to go with for testing purposes is to use port forwarding. If you're not familiar with this, it might seem like overkill, but actually it's really quick and easy to get started. So we're going to use a tool called ngrok that allows us to access ports on our local machine via the public web, and that means that Auth0 can then make calls to the Hasura database on our local machine. So you'll need to go to the ngrok website and just sign up with a free account. It's really simple, just takes a couple of minutes. That should then lead you to this page, which will guide you through installing it. So you just want to download the executable, and I recommend that you just put it in the root folder of the project that we're working in. It's probably the easiest thing to do. Just be careful if you're on WSL like me, that's the Windows subsystem for Linux, because although you're on Windows, you'll actually want the Linux version. Follow the next step to connect your ngrok executable to your ngrok account, and then you should be ready to go. So if you were to open up a terminal, so I have ngrok now here in my in the current directory. All you have to do is just run ngrok http and then the port number that you want to forward. So our Hasura instance is running on port 8080. So if we just put 8080, you'll see that ngrok will tell you that this URL here, which is a publicly available URL, is forwarding to the local port on your machine. So if you copy that and paste that into your browser, and you'll find that you'll end up on your very same Hasura instance that's running locally, except this is now available on the public web, so Auth0 can contact it. You'll see that your browser's forgotten the admin secret because it thinks it's a different website, but you might remember it is, by default, my admin secret key, I think. So that should let us in. But this is exactly the same as what we're looking at here on our local port. Let's start thinking about the query or mutation that the Auth0 action is going to need to execute on our Hasura instance. It's going to look something like this. We want to insert one user, and so we'll insert all three of these things. The ID is going to be the Auth0 user ID, so Auth0 will know that. The name, so in this case for the username, we'll use the email address because that's what I've used as the username so far, so Auth0 should know that as well. And then the role, and we'll default that to user, although obviously once this is in our database, the whole point is that we'll be able to change that at a later date in the database, and it will change the claims. We also have to return something, so I'll just return ID for now. So that essentially is the structure of the mutation that we want to execute. I'm going to make a couple of changes to this query, and I'll explain why in a minute. And it uses a couple of GraphQL features that I know I'm skimming over a little bit, but the focus here is really Hasura, so don't worry if you're not familiar with this GraphQL syntax already. The first thing is that you can give GraphQL queries and mutations names, so I'm going to call this insert user. And the other thing you can do is you can pass in parameters. So there are two main parameters that vary between different users here, which is their ID and their name. So those are the things that Auth0 is going to need to somehow pass into this query. And so for that reason, I'm going to make them input parameters here. Now in GraphQL, input parameters always start with the $ symbol. and then you put the type, which is a string, and the exclamation mark means that it's required. And then let's do the same thing for the name. You can see the syntax highlighter is complaining because they're not yet used. So let's now substitute them in to the place where they will be used. So the ID is going to be whatever ID parameter was passed in, and likewise for the name. So now we have a parameterized mutation. So we've sort of abstracted away. We can think of this mutation as just being the insert user mutation that takes two inputs, the user ID and the name. The reason I'm writing this here in the console is because Hasura has quite a cool feature, which is the code exporter. So if we select that mutation and then click here, you can see that it can generate some code for us to make this call to the API using, using a couple of different languages, JavaScript or TypeScript, and also using either a GraphQL client library like Apollo, which is what we've used on the front end, or just keeping it simple using just plain fetch and just sending just plain HTTP requests. Because behind the scenes, GraphQL is still actually just JSON data being sent over HTTP. This feature is going to be really useful for us for implementing our Auth0 action. We can just use the code that's been generated here. And if you scroll down, you'll see that it's created this function, execute insert user, that takes these two parameters. That's why it was useful to express this parameterized mutation, because it helps Hasura generate some nice usable code. We'll just leave that there for now, and we'll copy it in a moment. And let's now go to Auth0, and from the dashboard you can go to Actions, Flows, and then choose the post-user registration flow. So this is what happens after a user has successfully registered. You can see there's no custom actions right now, but we're going to create one. Call it Create Hasura User. You can see I've done that before. And so this is where we're going to write the code that's going to call that mutation on our Hasura instance. So first question is, where are we going to get these parameters from? Well, you'll see they're really easy to figure out with this IDE because we've got this event object, and you'll see on there's a user, and on the user you'll see the email and also the user ID. Those are the two things we needed. So that's going to be simple enough. So let's go back to our Hasura and copy the code, and then we'll start having a look at it. So starting from the bottom, you can see that what it actually does is it runs this start execute insert user. I'm not going to do that because obviously we're going to trigger it inside our action handler. And in fact, you can see that all this does is it then calls through to this execute insert user function, and it just handles the errors. So this is kind of top level stuff, I guess. So I'm actually going to take this, I'm going to get rid of this function, and I'm going to deal with this inside the handler instead. So what the handler is going to do is it's going to call execute insert user to fill in the ID parameter. I'm going to do event.user.userid, and instead of name I'll do event.user.email, because that's what I'm using as the username. Rather than just log those errors, instead I'm going to throw them, because given that we're executing in this Auth0 context, essentially we just want to kind of alert Auth0 if it fails, and then we can look through the logs and debug it if anything goes wrong. So I'm just going to be really lazy, and I'm actually just going to throw errors, which isn't great, but it'll at least cause Auth0 to know that it failed, and then probably no need to log anything there. So that essentially is all we need to do, but there are a few problems with this. First of all, if we scroll up, so you'll see that this thing actually calls another lower level function called fetch GraphQL. So this is where it's constructing a GraphQL request. And there's two problems with this. First of all, it's missing the fetch library. So you just want to import that. And use node fetch. I mean, even though node fetch is a third-party library, there's a list somewhere on the Auth0 documentation, and they have loads of common libraries already installed, so that won't be a problem. Then you may have noticed this undefined here. I'm not quite sure how exactly how Hasura has ended up doing this, but that is supposed to be the URL of our endpoint. And so what we're going to do is we're going to copy that from here. I don't quite know how Hasura didn't manage to put that in itself, but that's what that should be. So remember, it has to be our public one. This is our public port forwarding address. It can't be our actual local host because, of course, that won't work on Auth0. And then the final concern is authorization. Obviously, our Hasura API is not public, so we're going to require the admin secret in order for this request to work. And currently, we're not providing that. So we need to add into our fetch request, we need to add headers like this, and the header is x Hasura admin dash secret. And then there we somehow need to provide the secret value. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to modify this function and the function above it to pass it in, because there is a way that we can store that secret securely in Auth0 and have Auth0 pass it down that chain. So I'll show you how that's going to work in a moment. So let's just add on secret onto the end here. That's what I'm going to pass in there. And then I'll need to do the same, missing a comma there. I'll need to do the same for this function here. And so that's what that's going to pass in there, secret. And then finally, that means I need to somehow pass secret up here. So how do we do that? Where's the secret going to come from? We need to store it somewhere securely. It's not good practice to just hard code it straight into this code. Luckily, Auth0 has a really nice feature for that, and it's here under this key. You've got secrets, and we can just add a secret. So I'm going to call it Hasura admin secret. Then put in your secret key, which if you're still using the default is my admin secret key. And what Auth0 now does is it passes that secret in with the event. So let's just tidy this up a bit and bring it onto separate lines so we can see what we're doing. So we need to pass in the secret as the final argument, and it comes again from the event. You'll see that there's an object there called secrets, and on there's our Hasura admin secret. So it all works really nicely through Auth0's actions. I think we're ready to deploy this, so click deploy. And then don't forget you have to go back to the flow and you have to drag it in, otherwise it won't actually happen on user registration. Then click apply. Now we're ready to test. So let's go to our front end and log out, and we're going to try and sign up as a new user. So let's be user 3. So we're logged in, and let's go look in the database, data, users, and look at that. We've got a new record in the database. So that was inserted by the Auth0 action as soon as we signed up. But we're not done, of course, because what we really want is for this role here to end up in the token. And that's the other half of the functionality that we've not implemented. It's going to work in a really similar way. So we're going to go through a similar process to what we just did. The difference will be that we're going to modify the login action on Auth0, and we're going to fetch the user's role from Hasura and then use that to populate the token. So same process again. Go to Hasura. We're going to write out the query this time rather than a mutation because we're fetching data. So we want to get the user by primary key because we will know what their user ID is. It's their Auth0 ID. So that'll be something. And from that, we will want to get their name and their role. Like before, we'll now turn this into a parameterized GraphQL query. So let's call that get user. And the only argument is the user ID. I'll just call it ID to be consistent before. And that is a string. And then from this, I think the code exporter was just automatically updating then, wasn't it? Yeah, it was. So we've got our code ready to go. So let's go back to Auth0. and go to the flows, and this time choose the login flow. So we've already got this add Hasura claims. Oh, actually, I forgot when there's already one, you can't edit it from this view, unfortunately. So actually you need to go to custom. That's because we already had an action that we want to modify instead. I guess we just click on it. Let's copy the code from Hasura, and we're going to make the same changes that we did last time. So we need to import fetch. We need to copy the GraphQL endpoint and paste that in here. And we need to add the header. It's the X Hasura admin, secret. And we're going to set it to something that we're going to pass into this function, which will then get passed in to here. And then, just as before, we will get this from the secrets. And that will allow us to, well, I'm going to copy that, but get rid of all this like I did before and just stick it in here instead. So pass in event.secrets.Hasura admin secret. And like before, I'll just say if errors, then, well, we'll console log them, but then also throw them. You're not really supposed to throw things in JavaScript that aren't error objects, but I'm going to make an exception here. It'll kind of work. Oh, I haven't put in the user ID, so we know we can get that from the event. Tidy that up a bit. And so now this data variable should have everything we need, and we just need to get that out of data and into here. And let's just have a look at the way that structure looks. So I'm just going to turn this back into an unparameterized version again. And let's see, I'm going to need a user ID. So actually get one from here. Don't know why I'm sort of mixing and matching between my port forwarded Hasura and the other one, but it doesn't matter. So that data object is this data object here. So that tells you what the structure looks like. We're going to have this object called user by PK, and then we're going to have the name and the role. So it should be as simple as getting rid of all this hard-coded stuff we did before, where we'd hard-coded a particular user ID to have a particular role. We're not going to do that. Instead, we can, for any user, we can just set the role to be, so let's get this right. So it's going to be data.user.userbypk.role. That's right, isn't it? Userbypk.role, yeah. And copy that into the one below as well. And that's it. So let's go ahead and deploy that. It's already part of our flow because we'd used it before, so we don't need to do that. And so the test for this one will be what happens when we log out and then log back in, let's say as user 3. You might notice I'm getting these errors for saying that my JWT was issued in the future. I think that must be something to do with my Docker container. I'm not sure what it is, but as soon as I refresh, it's fine. I don't think it's something that would happen in production. And let's just copy the token and paste that in jwt.io to have a look at what we've got. And we do indeed have a role. So that is very promising. That implies that worked. But the ultimate test is going to be, what if I go to my data, go to my users, and I modify the role for this user. So let's change it to role 123. That role doesn't exist, of course, but it'll be a good test. So let's log out and log back in. And copy this token again. And you'll see this time it's populated with, it's definitely been populated with the role from the database. So that's it. We've managed to populate our claims based on the role in the database. So we got rid of all that horrible hard-coded stuff where we were checking against a hard-coded user ID. So I think this gives us lots of flexibility. Now that we've done this, we shouldn't need to touch those actions again, but we could, for example, write some admin screens or something in the front end that lets admins choose what roles different users have, and all that stuff would now filter through to the token without needing to change anything. There's one final thing I want to mention, because I'd obviously done that before and I guided you through. We managed to get through that without any errors, but if you do encounter errors with your actions, it's worth checking out an extension. You can find it under extensions, and it's called I think it's called the real-time debugger. I guess I already have it installed, so we'll see it there. Oh yeah, that's what I meant, the real-time web task logs. So you can search for that in all extensions if you don't have it, and then just add it to your account. And if you click on this, it has real-time updates from your actions. So these will actually be the console logs from your actions. I guess possibly I could trigger it if I were to log out and log in. So because I'm not actually logging anything in that action, it's not very interesting. But you can see that it logged the beginning and end of the task. And if you were to start putting console logs in there, or if an error was thrown, for example, this is where you'll see it. So this can be invaluable for debugging your actions. So that's the end of my segment on authentication and authorization. I'm going to cover one more topic in the final video, which is database migrations and the Hasura metadata. If you enjoyed this video and would like to help us to make more, please click the subscribe button. Thanks for watching.